quick note before we get started on a term we're going to use a lot today, cold-blooded. You know how when you're cold and you shiver and you get warm, or when you're hot, you sweat and it cools you down? Cold-blooded animals don't have this feature. Instead, they have to move themselves into the sun to warm up or into the shade to cool down. Hey guys, we're going to talk about fish, amphibians, and reptiles today. So first of all, let's classify fish. What makes a fish a fish? Well, first of all, they need a vertebrae. Secondly, they need to be cold-blooded. Thirdly, most of them have scales, but there are some exceptions. Fourthly, they lay eggs. Mostly, some of them give live birth. Thirdly, they breathe water. They suck it in through their mouth, collect the oxygen from the water, and spit it back out through their gills. And finally, they all have fins. Fish were the first vertebrates to evolve from invertebrates. They are cold-blooded and live in nearly all aquatic environments. Waters that are fresh, brackish, or salty, freezing, or tropical. With 32,000 different species, there is a broader diversity of fish than any other type of vertebrate. There are 4 categories of fish: ancient jawless fish such as lampreys, cartilaginous fish such as sharks, common ray-finned fish with bony skeletons such as tuna, and lobe-finned fish such as lungfish, which are thought to be the ancestors of all land-dwelling animals. These 4 groups show the various evolutionary stages that fish have gone through over millions of years. Most species of the primitive jawless fish that once inhabited Earth are now extinct, but their notochord has an evolutionary legacy. This flexible rod down their back forms a kind of rudimentary backbone which bridges the gap between the spineless invertebrates and their bony vertebrate descendants on the tree of life. Eventually, around 395 million years ago, some lobe-finned fish evolved into tetrapods. Tetrapods adapted to breathe air and inhabit land for the very first time in Earth's history. This evolutionary leap gave rise to amphibians, reptiles, and later birds and mammals. Sharks evolved about 420 million years ago, and today there are more than 470 species, including the great white shark, pictured below. It can grow up to 6.1 meters long, making it Earth's largest predatory fish. Unlike other fish, sharks have rough skin with dermal denticles rather than smooth scales, and while many lay eggs, some give birth to live young. They do not have a gas-filled bladder to stay buoyant in water. Instead, they rely on their oily liver and dynamic lift to stay at the right depth, cruising through water like birds do in air. This means that most sharks cannot move backwards, and that if they stop moving, they begin to sink. Ray-finned fish account for nearly 99% of all species of fish. All have a jointed backbone. They were the first animals to benefit from this key evolutionary development. Their rayed fins, webbed skin supported by bony spines, allow them to make quick and complex movements, such as moving backwards that cartilaginous fish cannot. Skates and rays are types of cartilaginous fish, making them younger relatives of sharks. They have long, thin tails which are often armed with a venomous sting, wide, disc-like bodies, and wings that they use to swim by beating them like a flying bird. Some species are commonly seen leaping out of the water. So what's the necessary rule for an amphibian to be classified as an amphibian? Well, it's really simple. The amphibian goes through a metamorphosis, kind of like what we discussed with the butterfly, except what's really cool about the amphibian is that they start off as a water-dwelling creature like a fish, and they end up as a land-dwelling creature like the reptiles that we'll get to next. In the beginning, they breathe water through gills, and in the end, they breathe air with lungs. This process is called metamorphosis, and their name comes from the Greek word amphibios, which means living both in water and on land. So cool. The first amphibians evolved around 370 million years ago from lungfish and were the first quadrupeds, or 4-footed creatures, to have jointed limbs. Approximately 10 million years later, unchallenged by predators, amphibians became the dominant animals on Earth. The climate, much warmer and swampier than today, suited them, and some amphibians grew to be bigger than crocodiles today. Around 250 million years ago, however, reptiles began to rise in strength and number. Consequently, modern-day amphibians are much smaller and fewer, falling into three major orders: Urodels, caecilians, and frogs and toads. Most species today still have 4 limbs, although caecilians have adapted to their burrowing lifestyle by having strong skulls and no limbs at all. Amphibians are cold-blooded, lay jelly-like eggs, and tend to live in freshwater environments. Most have small, primitive lungs, but are also able to breathe through their skin, which allows them to stay underwater without coming up for air. This means many amphibians can go dormant in winter, slowing their bodies and passing the colder months at the bottom of a pond or nearby water source. Urodela. This family of amphibians includes salamanders and newts. Similar to other amphibians, they have smooth, moist skin through which they absorb oxygen. This is easier in cold water, which contains more oxygen than warm water. This adaptation is so effective that some species have no lungs at all. Because their skin is delicate enough to allow oxygen to pass through, it is extremely sensitive to impurities, which makes them vulnerable to polluted water. This means that scientists often count the number of newts in an area to determine the health of the environment. Frogs experience a true metamorphosis. Most hatch from large batches of eggs laid in water and spend their first days as aquatic larvae known as tadpoles. These tadpoles have tails and gills that allow them to breathe underwater, and they have a vegetarian diet. Soon after hatching, the tadpoles start to grow lungs, 4 legs, and a large jaw, and their gills and tails disappear gradually in readiness for their move from water to land. Their eyes, tongues, and legs grow bigger, and, sometimes in the space of only a day, the tadpoles are transformed into insect-eating frogs. Complete this worksheet by looking at each animal and deciding whether or not it's a true reptile. Does it have a vertebrae? Is it cold-blooded? Does it have dry skin with scales? Does it lay eggs? Breathe air with lungs? Does it have short legs or possibly no legs at all? Reptiles evolved from amphibians nearly 320 million years ago. They were the first animals to live land-based lives, which is possible thanks to scales that keep their body moisture in. Most adapted to lay shelled eggs, which sealed in water and allowed them to reproduce on land. Some species hatch these eggs internally and give birth to live young. Reptilian anatomy evolved to allow its species to walk more easily on land than amphibians. Their name stems from the Latin word reptilis for creeping. Because of these adaptations, early reptiles had few predators and became a very successful class of animal. They grew huge in both size and number up to their apex of power as dinosaurs, which ended the amphibians' rule on Earth. For around 135 million years, dinosaurs reigned over the animal kingdom until a mass extinction around 65 million years ago. After that extinction event, reptiles became smaller and fewer in number. Modern reptiles share many characteristics with their dinosaur predecessors. They are cold-blooded and regulate their body temperature by moving between sun and shade. Many can shed and regenerate a limb, and some, such as chameleons, can even change color. In the tree of life, they form an important evolutionary link. Both birds and later mammals evolved from reptiles. The evolutionary link is so close, in fact, that crocodiles are more directly related to early kinds of birds than they are to lizards. The word crocodile comes from the ancient Greek word crocodilos, meaning worms of the stone, while the word alligator derives from the Spanish term for lizard, el lagarto. They are sociable and vocal and can often be found grouped together and communicating with one another on riverbanks or in freshwater lakes. Female crocodilians make fierce mothers and will guard their young for up to 2 years. Turtles' shells are attached to their bodies, and so their protective armor can never be taken off or left behind. Land-dwelling tortoises have higher domed shells, while aquatic species have flatter shells. To hide inside their shells, some species fold their head alongside their shoulder, while others retract their neck and head backwards. Box turtles have a hinged bony plate that allows their shells to close completely. Snakes are characterized by their lack of limbs and their long tube-like bodies. Their long and flexible backbone allows them an exceptional dexterity of movement. All are carnivorous and possess large, flexible jaws, which allow them to eat prey much larger than their own heads. Because their teeth are designed for killing but not chewing, they swallow their victims whole. Sometimes a snake's meal can be seen to travel down its body as it digests.